now know that the successful outcome of the war in France from the German side, the German victory in France, and the crashing defeat of both the French and the British armies, was nothing that could have been predicted right away. Instead, it was highly unlikely and the result of a whole chain of very, very poor military judgment on the British and French side. Giving at least partly credit to Chamberlain's original military assessment. Third, of course, is that in hindsight we know that the Allies, thank God, won this war, that the British, under the leadership of Winston Churchill, were able to withstand the German war efforts in a time when Britain was fighting alone, which again was far from certain when they were in this situation. The third or the fourth thing, I already lost track of my own counting, but the fourth thing is always how very well informed we are, especially as historians, when it comes to assessing the mistakes of the past, and how poorly we often are at predicting the future. And this holds true not only for historians, whose profession, of course, is not making predictions for the future, but for political scientists, sociologists, and so on. And when it comes to drawing the lessons of history, it's always very difficult to say which historical situation applies in a moment. One thing that I remember when it comes to Munich is 2014. When in 2014 Russia occupied Crimea, Munich was evoked very often, and many commentators, politicians, journalists, experts said, look, we have to draw the lessons or apply the lessons of Munich, and we have to stop the Russian aggression right now. Otherwise, it will go any further. It will go much further. Other commentators evoked a completely different lesson and evoked a completely different date, which was July 1914. And they said, we have to make sure that Europe won't stumble again in a large war without anybody willing that. So right now is not the time for sending strong military-backed messages, but it's the time for diplomacy. I'm not taking a stance here what would have been the right lesson, but it shows us that it's very, very difficult to just say, okay, it's one historical example and this applies 100% without studying the present situation thoroughly. And probably it's much more that knowing our history helps us to understand the complexity of a current situation. And I think we'll devote today's conference to exactly that, trying to get a better understanding of the factors that made Munich such a failure and that define appeasement as a wrong strategy, and then looking forward, trying to identify these factors and where we can really say this is appeasement policy that is bound to fail, and this, on the other hand, might be a totally legitimate diplomatic effort to stop the war, even a winnable war that we don't want to happen. So I'm really thrilled about this conference. I hope you're too, and I mean the mere fact that you're here shows your large interest, and looking at our excellent list of speakers, I'm sure we won't be disappointed, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you next year. Thank you very much.
So can the next panel come to the table?
I've never heard of this book. I have to write down the title. It sounds fascinating.
It's a really good book. Where would you like to put it? Yeah. Where's your, okay, that's where I thought I should.
Daniel, the live stream on our site isn't working.
Okay.
I'll be the first, okay? You will be in the order that is written. Yeah?
We need, I think, another chair.
No, it's okay. I think I should go through. Because there's the last man. There's the last man now picks up the check.
No, because I need all of these papers over here. I have your biographies, I have my sayings, so I need a lot of. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. In this room sees a lot of important discussions on contemporary subjects. We are always very intrigued and interested in what we discuss. We feel the need of discussing contemporary subjects, and today we feel so much the need of discussing a subject which belongs to 80 years ago. I must confess that coming here, I was just putting my mind on this emotion. I thought to myself, this gives us so many question marks and so many points to discuss about, exactly as if it were the peace process, the Palestinians, the Iran. I don't know if my fellow sitting in nearby me here at this table feel the same, but this is myself. I feel today the same. Today we are meeting on the 80th anniversary of the Munich Agreement to revisit this fateful historical event. So we really hope, as Doris said, that this conference will help us to understand the present better. We have an excellent panel which has accepted this challenge, and I would like now to introduce them to you. Shlomo Vineri, professor on political science at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a member of the Israeli Academy of Science and Humanities, served as Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry under Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. His most recent book is a very important intellectual biography of Theodor Herzl, but there are so many other important books that I would like to name, and it will take all of our time because there are so many. And he's the winner in 1996 of the Israel Prize, the most important prize in Israel, and you all know what it is. He will be the first speaker. We have Dr. Martin Kramer is an authority on the history of politics in the Middle East, contemporary Islam, and modern Israel. Kramer is a founding president of Shalem College in Jerusalem, Israel's first liberal arts college, where he continues to teach a modern history of the Middle East. He is also the Correct Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Also, the list of the university, as for Professor Avineri, where he has been teaching, is very long. Very long, the list of his books. I only want to name the one that I prefer, which is Ivory Towers of Sand. That's my preferred. Melanie Phillips, you all know her. I'm sure you ran to her blog in the morning, where she always gives very sharp interpretations, not only of the situation and history of Jerusalem, but she has a very deep insight for everything that concerns Europe and England. She's a journalist, a broadcaster, and an author. and is Britain's best known and most controversial champion of traditional values in the culture war. Her weekly column currently appears in the Times of London, but before that she has been in so many other important first-class daily newspaper. Today she also writes for the Jerusalem Post, and this is where you can find her writing. And then we have as a discussant Dr. Joel Fishman. He received his doctorate in modern European history from the Columbia University, and for years he served as an editor at of our Jewish Political Studies reviews here in the Institute, and continues to write on political warfare. I like to say also that Dr. Fishman is writing now with Yossi Cooperwasser a new essay about willful blindness, which is very much connected to our issue. Our discussion on the Munich Agreement raises question of direct historical importance as well as a set of unstated ones, even if it implies comparisons with the immensely evil, genocidal, monstrous politics of Hitler, and so they are always problematic. Nonetheless, returning to the subject of appeasement is always legitimate, particularly for us here in Israel, and especially in our times. Our dialogue with the past in hopes of understanding the present may be problematic, but it's helpful nonetheless. In this endeavor, we encounter so many unanswered questions, and we must confront our anxiety, our emotions as well. When, for example, we wonder what has been the use of the atomic agreement with Iran, we want to know if the Ayatollah played cat and mouse with the American administration. When we think of Gaza, we now ask if the Palestinians misled us, if we really believed in it, or if we betrayed ourselves and our fellows. This is my personal way of thinking about the subject. Of course, there can be many others. Chamberlain's policy of appeasement ended in a humiliating failure when on the 1st September 1939, Hitler attacked Poland. It should be remembered that days before, on the 23rd of August 1939, Nazi Germany signed the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Chamberlain's concession at Munich indeed carried a very high price, and most of all a moral price, selling out a little non-defended country, which was also an ally of theirs. The Munich Agreement has generally been viewed as the result of the beliefs and intentions of an incompetent leader, and this has been already discussed here by Dr. Brackel, but I'm sure it will have some other speaking about the issue, whose policy of appeasement was doomed to failure at the price of a shameless sacrifice of principles. Hitler immediately broke the agreement and transformed it in a license to invade Czechoslovakia and dominate. Munich deprived Czechoslovakia of 70% of its electrical power plants, iron and steel factories, all of its chemical works, and its heavily fortified underground border defenses along the German border. And this sacrifice, in the mind of Chamberlain and Daladier, was meant to advance the cause of peace. Now, the historical debate is still very, very alive. We already had a hint about this, and I won't go back to it. What was actually at that moment Hitler programs, if he already had in mind to implement all of the Mein Kampf, all that was written in Mein Kampf, if he already thought about his Lebensraum into different stages. This is a lot of questions, and I'm sure that our speakers will help. I also want to finish saying this. There is a book, there is an historian, a British historian, Alfred Leslie Rose, who was a member of All Souls College in Oxford and was particularly close to the intellectual advocates of appeasement at his time. In 1961, he published the classic Appeasement, A Study in Political Decline. And at the beginning of the book, he asked the same question that today we ask ourselves. His tone was of disappointment, shock, and anger. These people, he says, preferred to lap up the facts and arguments laid on for them by Nazi propaganda, to lend themselves to a degree I did not realize at the time, to Ribbentrop's schemes, clumsy, infantile, obvious as they were. What could have possessed them? How to explain their blindness? That is the problem. There can be no question now that these men were wrong, but how could they be so wrong in the face of everything? And why were they so wrong? There is a problem. It is a formidable one. So with this very difficult question, I leave now the floor to Professor Avineri. I ask our guests here to speak the first time for 10 minutes. Is it okay with you?
No.
No? How much do you need?
15.
15. 15 is fine. We have a deal. You can go.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm very grateful to have been invited. I'm particularly happy that this is done also together with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. At the Hebrew University, we had for many years and still have a very good cooperation with them. And the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is the only German political Stiftung with its headquarters in Jerusalem, for which we have to thank Chancellor Kohl. And this is a very important fact that we should bear in mind. As we have already heard, Munich is not just an historical location or historical event, it is also a political argument. And because it is a political argument, let me start by mentioning that in a very strange way, in a negative way, Munich also played a small role in Zionist history. When Herzl, after publishing the Jewish state in 1896, started working in order to convene what eventually became the first Zionist Congress, he looked for a relatively neutral place, not a capital like Vienna or Berlin, which would complicate the political context of Zionism, and his first choice was Munich. And the reason was complicated and interesting. On one hand, Munich at that time was considered to be the capital of German letters, not Vienna, not Berlin, but Munich. And it was a very cultural center at that time. Moreover, because of railway connection, Munich was a very easy place for access both from the east and from north and south. So Herzl sent two of his assistants to Munich to check the ground, and he found out that both Jewish Orthodox and Reform communities were extremely against having a Zionist political meeting in Munich, and they even threatened to appeal to the Bavarian government. Herzl, as a journalist, had good connections with the Bavarian government and asked the Bavarian Minister of Interior whether there is any objection, and the minister said no. It appeared that only trembling Israelites were very, very shocked about this. And for this reason, Herzl decided to move it to Basel. And there's an irony in it. Imagine the trembling Israelites in Munich would not be so trembling, and the first Zionist Congress would have been taking place in Munich, which would at that time be okay. But in Herzl's diaries, the canonic sentence, "In Basel I have founded the Jewish state," would now read, "In Munich I have founded the Jewish state," would not ring very well. So somebody is occasionally taking care of Jewish life and Jewish faith. Because appeasement and Munich are connected, one has, and I think Dori Gold has already mentioned it, to realize the multifaceted aspects of the Munich Agreement. And they are basically, if I may add to the three which Dori mentioned, two considerations, because things have to be viewed in political context. After all, neither the French nor the British leaders at that time were pacifists or people who were against the use of force. They were heads of great empires and very powerful and aggressive empires. But in the 1930s, one has to realize both France and Britain were still suffering from the traumas of World War I, which we today, in retrospect, do not realize. In World War I, hundreds of thousands of the cream of British and French society were killed in a war which to many people at that time and in retrospect look as something having to do with Serbia, with Sarajevo, not really with British or with French interests. And the idea that you do not want to create a situation in which Britain or France would get involved in another war about some far away countries, be it Danzig or Sudetenland or Czechoslovakia, like Sarajevo, was something very, very popular, both in Britain and in France. And the idea that appeasement, rather than the war-mongering Churchill, was very popular, not only in the Conservative Party in Britain, but among Labour, among church leaders, trade unionists. I wouldn't like to say it was a consensus, but it was nearly a consensus not to get involved in a war which will again create the death of hundreds of thousands of people on the officers' class, which has to do with the establishment, and among working class people. That's also why the Labour Party was against very much a war, because most of the people who were killed were not just the officers, the cream of British society, but working class people. So the trauma is very important to realize, and sometimes it's being said that generals usually fight the last war. Also politicians and statesmen fight or do not fight the last war. So the trauma of World War I, no more war, if one may use another language, was something very deeply rooted in the political culture of countries like France and Germany. France had a decline in its population. Britain had lost a generation of leaders and members of its society. So this trauma was very much behind it, and it created the atmosphere which made it possible for Chamberlain to wave the piece of the paper Hitler has signed and get the kind of applause which he got. The second issue had to deal with the Versailles Peace Treaty. And in this context, I want to mention that the Munich Agreement has one analogy in history, and it was mentioned indirectly here. And this is the Ribbentrop-Molotov-Stalin-Hitler Pact. In both cases, and I want to underline it, a democratic country or democratic countries and the communist totalitarian dictatorship decided wrongly and made at both Britain and France and Stalin's Soviet Union made strategic mistake and a terrible moral mistake in order to protect their own countries at the expense of other countries. In the case of Munich, it was Czechoslovakia. In the case of Ribbentrop-Molotov, it's basically Poland, which also Russia had, even Soviet Russia had an historical account with Poland. So they were not giving up something which was their own. They were mistakenly and morally wrongly giving up something else in order to protect themselves. They were not making concessions about British territory or Soviet territory or French territory. They were thinking wrongly that they were maintaining their political hegemony, again wrongly. They wrongly believed that one can trust Hitler, that Hitler does not have aims beyond limited aims, but one has to realize they did not give up any territory or any concession which was considered to be harmful to their own position. On the contrary, again, they were mistaken, but on the contrary. The second issue has to do with Czechoslovakia. What I'm saying in a very careful way. Czechoslovakia and the post-World War I order was formed by a number of treaties. The Versailles Treaty is the most important one. Then the treaty with Austria, Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The treaty with Hungary, Trianon. And as Margaret MacDonald of Oxford and Hedwa Ben Israel, who is here with us from Jerusalem, have shown, the Versailles Treaty and the other treaty suffered from an internal contradiction, which at that time very few people, Keynes perhaps, Harold Nicholson perhaps, saw most people at that time did not see. On one hand, the Versailles Treaty and the other treaties echoed President Wilson's idea of national self-determination. And that's why Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia in a different context, Poland, were granted independence in the name of national self-determination. As a universal principle, this is something which, if one looks at a universal normative level, it's very difficult to object to. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, when it came to drawing borders, the Versailles Treaty and Saint-Germain and Trianon contradicted the idea of national self-determination. Because of raison d'etat, many French, but also British, the treaties, all of them together, prevented Austria, which was left to the ethnic German small Austria as it is today, prevented by treaty Austria joining Germany because France was not interested in a strong Germany. Moreover, after the implosion of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in November 1918, the German-speaking groups in what eventually became Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland opted democratically for union either with Germany or with Austria and not be part of Czechoslovakia, which was a Slavic, whatever, country. And they were prohibited doing it. So the treaty, on one hand, spoke on the right of self-determination, and on the other hand, denied self-determination to the Austrian Germans and to the Sudeten ethnic Germans. And this is something which was viewed not, and Hitler obviously used it, but this is something which social democrats tried to prevent. The social democratic government in Austria in 1918 tried to unite with Germany and create a social democratic Greater Germany with a strong German Social Democratic Party and a ruling Social Democratic Party in Austria. So this is something which, when Hitler was able to reach it in Munich, received so much support in Germany because it expressed what was a political consensus in Germany, including Social Democrats and including liberals in Germany and in a way in Austria. So this internal contradiction made it so very difficult to argue against ideas which were then utilized by Hitler cynically about self-determination in case of Austria and Sudetenland. As a footnote, I want to mention that when you look at Hitler coming from Austria, the fact that his first political aims were unification of Austria and Germany and the annexation of the Sudetenland, this was typically an Austrian pan-German agenda, much more than a German agenda. Then, of course, came Poland and Danzig, etc. We know that. So one has to understand that sometimes peace treaties, especially if they are couched in language of universal values, can clash with realpolitik, and this is exactly the weakness of Versailles. I hope I'm not going to be misunderstood. One of the better things of World War II was, at the end, that there was no peace treaty. And it was based on realpolitik, a very harsh realpolitik in Eastern Europe, and it didn't have the kind of internal tensions that Versailles had. Now, there's a question dealing with Munich. And again, the very realpolitik approach of the Brits and the French, and later of Stalin, is obvious. One of the questions which has been raised, and is peripheral to our discussion, but I think it should be mentioned, is, and it was, I think, mentioned again by Dr. Nierenstein, why didn't Czechoslovakia militarily oppose the German aggression? One argument is that Czechoslovakia was really weak, Germany was already rearmed. This is okay. There is an interesting paragraph in the book by Madeleine Albright's father, Corbel, who was one of Beneš's closest secretaries, in which he says that one of the reasons Beneš had doubts whether to mobilize the Czechoslovak army was the Czechoslovak army was 35% Slovak and 10% ethnic German. Sudeten, and he couldn't trust them, which means that the idea of a multi-ethnic country, be it Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, is something very, very problematic when you're faced with a crisis. This is something from which one can learn. Churchill was the one who really understood that Munich is doomed because he viewed it not in terms of the previous war, not in terms of the internal contradictions of Versailles, but in terms of trying to understand the political aims of Hitler and of German Nazism. And in the political debate in Parliament, he said that, of course, this is a total defeat, an unmitigated defeat for Britain, and he was right. Let me add by a note which is important, I think, to us here in Israel. Sometimes it's being said that the people who were responsible for appeasement, Chamberlain, eventually, a few months later, appeased also the Arabs. And in the spring of 1939, the British White Paper, which limited very harshly Jewish immigration, put a cap on it to Palestine, and did not allow Jewish purchase of land in British mandatory Palestine. And there is, as in many cases, a dialectical irony here. The White Paper was not a parallel to the Munich appeasement, but on the contrary. After the failure in 1938, winter of 1938, the Chamberlain government realized that Hitler and Nazi Germany had aims vis-à-vis Poland, Danzig, the Polish corridor. And in the winter of 1938, the same government that was responsible for appeasement began preparing for war. In the winter of 1938-39, the draft was reintroduced in Britain after it was abolished after World War I. Civil defense was started, including plans to evacuate hundreds of thousands of children from London to the countryside, which happened later, but the plans were there. And Britain also developed radar, which at that time was something very marginal, nobody cared about it. But the Royal Air Force had, in the Battle of Britain, the access to radar, which meant that it knew where its planes were flying, whereas the German Luftwaffe was flying blind. And they thought in imperial terms that one of the most important things for Britain to prepare for war is to guarantee its access to India and the Indian Ocean, the Suez Canal. This was at the time of the Arab rebellion, the Maoraot of 1936, 38, 39, when the British army in Palestine, together with the Haganah, fought against, if you wish, the Mufti and the Arab rebellion revolt here. And Britain decided to reverse its policy, realizing that if you want to maintain access to the Suez Canal, you have to minimize friction with the Arabs in Palestine and with their supporters in the Arab countries. In one of the meetings between Ben-Gurion and the British colonial secretary, Malcolm MacDonald, the son of Ramsay MacDonald, whom Ben-Gurion knew from background of the labor, Ben-Gurion asked him, "What are you doing?" And the British answer was very clear in terms of British realpolitik and understandable in British realpolitik. MacDonald told Ben-Gurion, and I'm making it sound harsher than it was because it was very polite, he said, "There are more of them than of you. There are more Arabs than Jews." Secondly,
Professor,
Secondly, he said, Hitler is your enemy, you're going to be on our side. The Arabs have another option, which we knew, the Mufti, Rashid Ali al-Khilani and others eventually did. So, and this is one of the cool aspects of history, that at the moment when the British government decided that appeasement with Hitler doesn't work, and they were preparing for war. One of the possible victims were the Jewish issue in Palestine, and it took Ben-Gurion some time, in contradiction to other Zionist leaders who were either shocked or completely confused or neutralized by the British rule, by the British decision on the white paper, to come up with a slogan which was really his light during World War II. We have to fight against Hitler as if there is no white paper, and we have to fight against the white paper as if there is no Hitler. A very pragmatic, problematic, and wise decision. So as Dori has said earlier, the Munich Agreement is multifaceted. We cannot just understand it in terms of what was done in 1938. It was done in a political, historical context. One of the great mistakes of world policy in the 1930s, and it shows that political leaders, when it comes to the interests of their own country, have no problem sacrificing third parties. Czechoslovakia in one case, Poland in another case, and there's something that can be learned from that. Thank you very much.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Professor Ravineri. You also opened the window on this side of the world, and I think that this will be something that is worth further discussion. I also want to remember something that my friend Cecilia reminded me, that was the time when the racial laws were started to be promoted, either in Germany and in Italy, and nobody mentioned that. I don't find any trace of that in the history books that speak about that period. Nobody, no the British, no the French, never named it while discussing with Hitler any further agreement. Let's not forget this. This is one of the part of the appeasement. It is. Okay, so Professor Kramer, now the word is yours. Please keep the time, because don't oblige me to stop you, because
Yes,
it's so unpleasant. You say so
15 minutes, no more to the minute.
That's the reason why it's so unpleasant to stop them, because it's so interesting.
Well, thank you. Good morning. I am honored to have been invited to this event. This is not the first time. In fact, if we go back further, there was an event commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Accord, which was also supported by the Adenauer Foundation. I had the privilege of speaking there. So I'm a recidivist, and I'm glad to be back on an event taking place more than 20 years later. Munich enjoys a special place in the debate over the value of historical analogies. As I'll show, it is fading away as a point of reference, and I'm skeptical as to whether this can be reversed, even by conferences like this one. But I want to begin by focusing on the heyday of the Munich analogy, when it had its most purchase. First, though, a general observation about analogies in policy making. An analogy maps the known onto the unknown. We're caught between the known past and the unknowable future. A historical analogy becomes a blind man's walking stick in the shadows of uncertainty. The lessons of history, such as they are, constitute attempts to project future outcomes on the basis of past ones. Enter the historical analogy in two forms. First, what I'd call far analogies. The West has the fall of Rome to haunt it, and we Jews have the fall of Jerusalem. And these memories are present in the culture, sometimes in the religion, but they don't operate on the policy level. Then there are the near analogies. These draw on past events that are closer to us in time, and the most potent ones draw on events we've experienced ourselves. Bismarck said that wise men learn from the mistakes of others, fools learn from their own. But we're not good at that. Our own mistakes are especially painful. Our own successes are uniquely gratifying, so we dwell on them. So each generation has its own set of near analogies from which it seeks to draw the lessons of history. Now, as Shlomo has shown, the generation that appeased Hitler in 1938 was anxious not to repeat the terrible mistakes that led to the First World War. For the next generation, which had to fight the Second World War, Munich was the terrible mistake that stood as a reproach and a warning. And most of us knew people of that generation. They were our parents, they were our teachers. In the spring, my teacher and our friend and mentor, Bernard Lewis, passed away just shy of 102. In 2006, he said this about Iran, and I quote him, "I have often thought in recent years of World War II. I'm ancient myself. The most vividly remembered year of my life was the year 1940. And more recently, I've been thinking of 1938 rather than 1940. We seem to be in the mode of Chamberlain and Munich rather than of Churchill. What I'm afraid of is that we seem to be doing the same thing now as moving from retreat to retreat." End of quote. Now, 1940, of course, was the year when the bombs rained down on London, and Lewis and his generation went to war for 5 more years, and millions never came home. The Munich analogy was never more vivid than it was for Lewis's generation, those who fought the war, waited their turn, and finally got it in the post-war. They would do things differently. Mm-hmm. Now, the man who first got his turn in Britain was Prime Minister Anthony Eden. He'd resigned as Foreign Secretary, partly over the earlier appeasement of Mussolini, and he'd come back under Churchill. As his biographer wrote, "Munich made Eden just as surely as it unmade Chamberlain." But it would be the Munich analogy that would unmake Eden. When Egypt's Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company in 1956, Eden reacted as though it were the Nazi seizure of the Sudetenland. Eden said this in the Commons on the eve of the Anglo-French attack, and I quote him, "There are those who say that we are not justified in reacting vigorously until Colonel Nasser commits some further act of aggression. That was the argument used in the 1930s to justify every concession that was made to dictators. That led to the subjugation of Europe and to the Second World War. We must not help to reproduce, step by step, the history of the 30s. We have to prove ourselves wiser this time." End of quote. But the Americans saw Nasser differently, and Eisenhower pulled the plug on the Suez adventure. Eden lied in the Commons about the collusion with Israel and ended up resigning. So, 18 years after Munich, the first post-war generation got its own near analogy, which was Suez. Its lesson: avoid conflicts with awakening nations in Asia and Africa, even if their leaders are, let's say, shall we say, abrasive. The natives aren't that dangerous anyway. In Cold War America, as Ambassador Gold indicated, the Munich analogy had a longer life. It was used by Harry Truman in his 1950 speech, justifying the dispatch of troops to Korea. In his memoirs, he recalled the day he learned of the crossing of the 38th parallel, and I'll quote him. "Flying back over the flatlands of the Middle West and over the Appalachians that summer afternoon, my thoughts kept coming back to the 1930s, to Manchuria, to Ethiopia, the Rhineland, Austria, and finally to Munich. Here was history repeating itself. If we let the Republic of Korea go under, some other country would be next and then another. And all the time, the courage and confidence of the free world would be ebbing away just as it did in the 1930s." End of quote. Now, of course, the war in Korea didn't unfold anything like the war in Europe, and neither did the settlement. Later presidents repeatedly cited the Munich analogy in defending Vietnam policy. Dory brought one quote from Lyndon Johnson. I'll bring another. When he announced the dispatch of combat troops to Vietnam in 1965, he explained it to the public this way: "Surrender in Vietnam would not bring peace, because we learned from Hitler at Munich that success only feeds the appetite of aggression." And Richard Nixon, who inherited the war, wrote this in his memoirs: "What had been true of the betrayal of Czechoslovakia to Hitler in 1938 was no less true of the betrayal of South Vietnam to the communists advocated by many in 1965. Now, Vietnam ended with helicopters retreating from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The war's ultimate effect in America was similar to that of Suez in Britain. That is, the near analogy displaced the farther one for the generation which was traumatized by Vietnam. The result was the Vietnam syndrome. The reluctance to use force in Asia, Africa, and Latin America against nationalist upsurges, even when they were colored communist red. This would later be compounded by the American adventure in Iraq. There, too, both in 1990 and 2003, presidents named Bush invoked Munich. After Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, George H.W., who was the last U.S. president who fought in the Second World War, said this: "If history teaches us anything, it is that we must resist aggression or it will destroy our freedoms. Appeasement does not work. As was the case in the 1930s, we see in Saddam Hussein an aggressive dictator threatening his neighbors." And George W. said something similar when he moved to overthrow Saddam in 2003. But by then, old school, straight-up analogies with the 1930s no longer had the same punch. We could see this in the way the analogy was tweaked by Tony Blair in a 2003 speech that opened the Iraq debate in the Commons. He began by noting that there are glib and sometimes foolish comparisons with the 1930s. He's already making a concession to his critics. And I continue the quote. "The threat today is not that of the 1930s. It is not big powers going to war with each other. The ravages of political ideology inflicted on the 20th century are memories. The Cold War is over. Europe is at peace." But then, in a typically Blairish fashion, he manages to slip in the analogy anyway, and I refer you back to the original statement. But as Blair's hedging showed, by 2003, the Munich analogy had been devalued. The most potent analogies in the political arena are the nearest ones, the lived ones, the remembered ones, not the far historical ones. And in the 21st century, Munich was receding, supplanted not just by Suez and Vietnam, but soon by Iraq itself, a war thought to have ended badly. And for the last decade, I submit, the West, especially American Britain, has lived in the shadow of the Iraq analogy. The last gasp of the Munich analogy in America from a leader may have occurred in 2013, when John Kerry, of all people, right, invoked it while lobbying for congressional support for action in Syria. He described the decision point as a Munich moment. And people had no idea how he'd gotten to that, given his own Vietnam history, and one doubts whether his boss approved it. So who's left? Well, the last major Western leader who still invokes Munich is our own prime minister in relation to Iran. Earlier this year, he attended the Munich Security Conference. This obviously invited the analogy. That he made it isn't surprising, but I think it's telling that even he had to hedge it a little bit. After mentioning the disastrous agreement, the concessions to Hitler that only emboldened the Nazi regime and so on, he added this: "Let me be clear, Iran is not Nazi Germany. There are many differences between the two." So like Blair on Iraq, he was reading the minds of his critics. But he quickly added, there are also some striking similarities, most notably between the Munich Agreement and the Iran nuclear deal. "Let us pledge today," he concluded, "here in Munich, not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Appeasement never works." End of quote. Now, when I read this, I asked myself why I thought this appeal probably fell flat. The answer isn't Israel loathing or Bibi fatigue. It's because we're now stuck with the tab for the Munich analogy's patchy history. It was tarnished over decades by those who deployed it to defend controversial military actions that had unhappy outcomes. And when we trot it out, we may be associating our legitimate concerns about the Iranian threat with bitter memories about Iraq and Vietnam. People hear Munich invoked and say to themselves, when did I first or last hear that from a leader? The answer, unless you're living in assisted living, isn't Churchill. It's Johnson and Nixon, Blair and Bush. In other words, leaders who got us or kept us in bad wars. The other reason that the Munich analogy is depreciating fast is
True. Absolutely true.
Consider this. Over the summer, a poll on the historical knowledge of Czechs appeared in Prague. Now, we're speaking of Czechs, mind you. So over 70% know about 1968, right, the Prague Spring. Only 54% know of the Munich Agreement.
54.
54, and among the millennials, that is age 18 to 34, it drops to 40%. If less than half of Czech millennials know what the Munich Agreement was, then you can be sure that European millennials, and even more so American ones, know even less. After all, in April, it was shown that only a third of American millennials could identify Auschwitz as a concentration or extermination camp, By the time millennials will be making high policy, in 20 years, appeasement at Munich will ring as many bells as the assassination of Sarajevo rings today, which is to say, none. Now, I'm a historian, so far be it for me to say that historians should give up. Our role is to preserve and expand knowledge of the past in the hope that it might provide some insight into the human condition. But in the political arena, knowledge of Munich is now so thin that it's probably not worth it for politicians to invoke it again, maybe ever again. An analogy maps the known unto the unknown. It loses all potency if you have to explain both ends of the analogy. In fact, we have another analogy, a nearer one. It's 50 years younger, of a victory over an implacable ideological. This one had a fortunate ending for the Jews, and it's especially relevant to Iran, where a resentful people is stirring. It's an analogy that might serve as the natural successor to Munich, if only we could stop pandering to Vladimir.
Okay. Okay. Great and very full of questions. Is it worth to remind, to recall the Munich analogy, or is not? Here we have really a very tough question. Melanie, please.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Boker Tov. Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm supposed to be speaking to you about the role the media played in shaping public opinion to support the Munich Agreement. I should make a disclaimer at the very beginning that I'm a journalist. I'm someone who has worked and do work for some of the newspapers who played a totally inglorious role in the Munich debacle. When people think of Britain and the Second World War, they think of 1940 and the Blitz, and if you've seen the movie Churchill, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it, you will think of Britain in the way that Britain likes to think of itself, as we stood alone. We stood alone in 1940 against the Nazi threat, and we were vital in the defeat of Hitler, and that's entirely true. But what's less known, and certainly not talked about in Britain, I think at all, is that until the beginning of the Second World War, Britain was the country of appeasement, the country of Munich, the Munich Agreement. When Chamberlain, he was cheered by Britain to the rafters. So much is reasonably well known. So the question is why appeasement was so much in vogue in Britain, and how important was the media in shaping that view? Now, much has been made of the actual support for fascism by certain newspapers and politicians, and their support of Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, otherwise known as the Black Shirts. In 1933, the Daily Mail, for which I have worked, claimed that British newspapers had been full of, quote, rabid reports of Nazi excesses. Instead, the newspaper claimed of these rabid reports weren't true. Instead, Hitler had saved Germany from, quote, Israelites of international attachments and immense benefits that the new regime is already bestowing upon Germany. In January 1934, Lord Rothermere, who owned both the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror, wrote under his own "Give the Black Shirts a Helping Hand." And although his support for Mosley in Britain duly waned, Lord Rothermere remained an admirer of both Hitler and Mussolini and Czechoslovakia. But as soon as the war started, however, in 1939, the Mail turned on a dime. And it reversed its position. That Lord Rothermere died in 1940. His son, Esmond, assumed control of the paper the previous year. And from the outbreak of the war, the Mail did not express any support for Hitler at all. Now, the Mail wasn't the most influential paper. The most influential paper, you could say, was the Times, because it was the mouthpiece of the establishment. Of a pro-Hitler group called the Anglo-German Fellowship. It's been claimed, I think very authoritatively, that Dawson censored the reports by the Times' own correspondent in Berlin at the time, commented, quote, "The trouble for Ebert was that his newspaper, the most esteemed in England, would not publish, induced the British government to do likewise. The unpleasant truths that Ebert telephones nightly to London from Berlin were often kept out of the great newspaper. But in March 1939, now, in the political class, there were some or they had contact with British fascists in Mosley's outfit, yet others had sympathies with Italian fascism. To a certain extent, this support for fascism was influenced by the fear of Bolshevism and the belief that fascism was a bulwark against Bolshevism. But in the main, appeasement principal fact about Britain itself and a deep and fearful certainty of national decline, and the second inflicted on Britain by the First World War. Now, I know mention has been made of this already, but it's really hard to overstate the, I would suggest, very much today, and changed everything in Britain. Entire generation of the brightest and best. It destroyed Britain's sense of itself forever. It destroyed its religious class, it destroyed its belief in European civilization, and it destroyed its belief in itself. And that remains true today. The war that was supposed to end all wars, the Great War of 1914 to 18, was viewed as it is today as senseless. The end of that war, to prevent Germany from ever again becoming a threat, had caused Hitler to come to power and had caused Germany to become one of the elements of Germany. If you were going to go to war to stop Germany, you would have to have a war. The words was Britain's own never again moment. Never again would Britain embark on a world war, and risk fear was amplified by a chronic pessimism about Britain itself. The late 20s and the early 30s saw Britain struggling with the Great Depression. At the Empire, the British Empire was beginning to fall apart, with uprisings in India and, of course, here. Economically, Britain was losing out to an expanding Italy, an expanding Germany, and an expanding Japan. So most of the support for appeasement came from a perception of the national interest. With hindsight, we can say this perception of the national interest was wrong. People at the time also said it was wrong, but it was a perception that the national interest would not be served by going to war. Lord Beaverbrook, perhaps the most influential press baron of them all, who owned the Daily Express. He was personally anti-fascist. He also thought a European war was not only possible, but even likely. But nevertheless, according to his biographer, A.G.P. Taylor, what Beaverbrook insisted was that Britain need not be involved in such a war, provided she kept clear of European alliances and built up her armament. So he was against Hitler. He was no fascist, but he was a strong appeaser. And he was, I would suggest, he was certainly the most influential press individual of the. Anything was better than that. And as that's the mindset of appeasers, isn't it? You start with a proposition that is a very rational. For example, that once Hitler's territorial designs on Czechoslovakia were met, Sudetenland, they believed the Sudeten Germans were under foreign domination in Czechoslovakia, partition of Czechoslovakia, of the civilization that they believed would be the result of another terrible war. You could not. Appeasement was saving civilization because it would prevent war. They did not see that they were between a rock and a hard place, that Hitler was intent on destroying civilization, and that in many voices against appeasement, many writers in periodicals such as the Fortnightly or Contemporary Review, the New Statesman and Nation, they all wrote aggression. Letters to the Times expressed horror at the Times' own editorial position. The main critic of Hitler in British newspapers was a cartoonist, David Lowe. Now, the London Evening Standard, which was owned by the conservative grandee and arch-appeaser Lord Beaverbrook, because he was so popular, now Lowe's cartoons attacked Hitler and Mussolini so effectively that his work was banned in Germany and Italy. And after the war, it was revealed that in 1937, the German government had asked the British government to have discussions with the notorious Lowe to get him to stop attacking appeasement. However, most printed opinion was in favour of appeasement. The press overplayed Germany's military invincibility and underplayed Hitler's fanatical and unassuageable ambition to conquer Europe. Now, the great question is this: does the media shape public opinion, or is the media shaped by it? Now, I can tell you that any successful newspaper editor pays very, very careful attention to what his or her readers actually think. High-minded newspapers, such as The Guardian, make it their business to tell readers what to think, because The Guardian knows better than anyone what people should think. And the readers say they are very happy being told what to think by The Guardian, because they know that that is unarguably right. Popular newspapers, who are read by millions and millions of people, unlike high-minded newspapers which are read by a few people, popular newspapers wouldn't dream of telling their readers what to think, because they would not have any readers left. They reflect what readers actually think. So the idea that the media's narrative actually changes involved. Now, in the 30s, it was very different from the situation today. The situation today is that people now dismiss the media, the mainstream media, as telling lies, fake news and all that, because there's social media. But in the 30s, there was no alternative to the mainstream media. They had a monopoly of information, and they were a cozy cartel in the 30s with politicians. It's been argued by historians, appeasement articles and news, and so no alternative to the policy of appeasement was ever consistently articulated in the press. And that was true not just of the press, of the national press, but online regarding appeasement. Now, as the process leading up to the Munich Agreement was a tortuous and controversial one. It looked as if there was going to be peace, then it was peace in our time, then it was terrible, then it was peace in our time again. Munich Agreement was signed. The press and everybody cheered Chamberlain to the rafters, except for certain newspapers. The Guardian, on the day that the terms under which Hitler's troops begin their march into Czechoslovakia today, can feel other than unhappy. Certainly the Czechs will hardly appreciate Mr. Chamberlain's phrase that it is peace with honour, politically increased power. And virtually as soon as that piece of paper was signed, dissenting voices started making themselves heard. And once the war started, of course, it became considered very, very important. To win the war, you had to ensure that there was no loss of morale and defeatism. It was considered absolutely essential that the press should keep the public cheerful, optimistic and committed, because it was understood very, very clearly that public demoralization had contributed to the defeat of Germany in the First World War, that public demoralization had contributed to the fall of France in the Second World War, and that morale had to be kept up. So finally, what conclusions can we reach as far as today is concerned? It has an insidious effect in creating a narrative which sticks, particularly if it's not if it's one homogeneous narrative. And the BBC in particular is exceptionally important in this respect, because the BBC, unlike newspapers, which are considered to be, fake news, the BBC is regarded still as broadly as entirely trustworthy. What the BBC says is true. And unfortunately, what the BBC says is actually a groupthink narrative which twists reality in accordance with a very highly ideological position. During the Iraq War, was it the Iraq War or the Falklands War? One of the wars, recent wars in which Britain was involved, involving its navy, the crew threw its radio into the sea, because what the BBC was transmitting was so demoralizing that they couldn't fight a war listening to the BBC. That was today. And so there's a groupthink that the BBC reflects, a groupthink about war. The BBC is against them all, and they are all linked. And it's not just the BBC. It's the newspapers in general. It's the intellectual class in general. They all basically agree on one crucial thing. The entire intellectual class thinks this and has thought this, I would suggest, going back to the Great War of 40. The slaughter of war is senseless, and nothing can be any better. Nothing can be worse than war. And so you have now, conflict resolution, which is all the rage. Instead of war, you find a number of groupthink ideas which take root, which are all false, but which add to the impression that there is a logical reason to avoid war. So, for example, in the United Kingdom to Iran, if you ask the public, are they frightened about Iran? They will say, yes, I am very frightened about Iran. And what are they frightened of? They're not frightened that Iran's terrorist regime will do things to destroy Israel. They are frightened that there will be war against Iran, because then innocent people will die. In Britain, there is virtually no coverage of the thousands of rockets coming in from the south, from Gaza into the south of Israel. That is not a story. The only terrible thing is war, when people die who are innocent. And so you have a situation today in which these are many notion of a narrative which minimizes, for example, the danger of Iran, which promotes lies about Israel and the Middle East, which labels concern about the Islamization of Europe as Islamophobia, all of which playing exactly the same role in society as the media did in the 30s. So if Britain were fighting World War II today, I'm afraid Britain would lose. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So we had these three great and very interesting presentations. Now we have our discussant. And I pray to come to the Dr. Fishman. We are very late on the schedule, so you can speak your 15 minutes, and then we will try to give the floor to some questions.
Thank you very much, Fiamma, and I'd like to thank all of the members of the panel. Is it on? And the members of the panel. My job is to be the responder of the yeshiva world. We're sitting with the Gedolei Hador. These are the best scholars of our generation, and I don't see any reason to history and how things work sometimes better than historians. So I like to regard some of my journalist friends as from Professor, from Martin Kremer and Melanie, an insight into, and also from Fiamma, insight into the problem and all of its come to bring to us. What we can say is that we have a dialogue with the past, how we relate to the past and how it affects our present and how we look at the future. And when I went to school, they used to say that history teaches us this or that. We can learn from history, but history as a force is not something of that works by its own power. So in a certain sense, a little bit just the same, we must not give up. I have been reading about appeasement, and I will read you from a document that will show this. And also, one of the side effects of the appeasement treaty, the Treaty of Munich, was that all opposition to Hitler from the German general staff was ended at that moment because he was a genius, but morally he undercut the internal opposition within the structure of the German government. What we do have in our time is the idea of accountability of the decision makers, as we look ever were, and that I think is reflected in our general outlook. I'm going to just say that we received one example of making use of history from the German historians who wrote history honestly and dispassionately, and it was called Coping with the Past, or Vergangenheitsbewältigung. In other words, telling the truth and rather than embellishing it. It used to be the tradition in many continental schools to have a straight nationalist history, but with the evolution of history writing in Germany, also in certain parts of Europe, the idea of writing contemporary history on an honest basis, writing in Austria. And the idea is a good idea, and we could use some more of this coping with the past. I just wanted to read you a little chapter. There was a letter from Sir Orm Sargent to Wheeler Bennett on the idea of appeasement, and he wrote a letter to Wheeler Bennett in 1946, and Sir Orm Sargent was the equivalent of the Director General of the British Foreign Office in its time, although he was a bureaucrat, and he wrote about the ethics of appeasement. Many a time, both in international affairs as in personal relations, appeasement is the only wise and prudent course to adopt to break an immediate deadlock and at the same time achieve an ulterior aim. It becomes questionable as a method of negotiation only if it can be shown to be immoral. That is, the appeaser sacrifices the rights and interests of a third party and not his own when making his concession, or if it is clearly dangerous, that is, when the concession made seriously undermines the strength of the appeaser, either internally or internationally. This is especially so when the concession has to be repeated, for appeasement then becomes nothing less than blackmail. And lastly, when his concession gets no quid pro quo in return. And then he wrote, you remember the famous passage in Mein Kampf, you probably know it by heart, when Hitler frankly and cynically expounds and justifies his whole method of political and military undermining. If Chamberlain did not know this passage or had forgotten it, he showed criminal negligence. If he knew it and chose to ignore it, he was taking a criminal risk which could not be explained away. This is from within the British establishment. Now, the last part, which is very, very interesting, and I will read it to you, but although Hitler was not propitiated, I do not believe that he was deceived by our servile act of abnegation. He must have interpreted it as proof that his method was succeeding even better than he had dared to expect, and that we have reached quicker than he had anticipated the ultimate stage of demoralization, which is the forerunner of complete capitulation. How could he, poor man, have been expected to understand that the worm was at last going to make ready to turn? If he had realized this, he might have hesitated in 1939 to make his next move as soon as was laid down in his timetable. Calculating, Stalin too might have reached other conclusions than he did, but neither Hitler nor Stalin did interpret the Chamberlain intervention at Munich. Far from delaying the war or enabling us to enter it, in improved circumstances, may well have precisely had what Sargent was referring to. What were the chapters of Hitler's book in Mein Kampf? And I looked in Mein Kampf and I couldn't find it. So at the time I wrote a letter to Professor Eberhard Jäckel in Munich, who wrote the classical book on Hitler's Weltanschauung, and I sent him the letter of Wheeler Bennett, and I asked him, and he gave an interesting answer, and we could say it's a chidush. I do not know a certain passage, neither a famous one as Sir Orm Sargent wrote, nor his whole method of political and military undermining, whereas his aims were war of conquest, and removal of the Jews, he was not interested in justifying his method. It was rather the very essence of his whole book that his aims were to be attained unconditionally, that is, without previous blackmailing. So the interesting turn which Jäkel said was that he did. And I'll just read you a few observations from Sir Neville Henderson, who was the British ambassador to Hitler's Germany before the war. And Henderson was considered to be an avid Nazi sympathizer and in favor of Czechoslovakia's ceding of the Sudeten after he'd gotten what he wanted. He was ready to sign anything. He was ready to guarantee any frontier and to conclude a non-aggression pact with anyone. Each stage was always the last for him until he reached it. As soon as that position was gained, he advanced on to the next. This is all that I would like to contribute. I think that we were privileged to hear these fine speakers. I certainly would gratefully express my appreciation.
Bravo. So now here what we have from Dr. Fishman is just an underlining the peculiarity of the personality of Hitler. So in this case, the disqualification of appeasement is related particularly to that historical situation. Is it or not? That is the question now. So is the word completely disqualified, appeasement, or is it not? So now I would like to give the floor to to give the floor to the cancer, but I will do it later. We give now 10 minutes for question and answer. Please, you quickly put your question, okay? That's our agreement. You don't, you present yourself and you quickly put your question. Please, Tamar. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Ben Malav. I teach international relations and conflict resolution. I'm sorry to mention that. At Bar-Ilan University, but I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Hans Morgenthau. I'd like maybe just to change the slight wording. Bar-Ilan University. The lesson, casually, but should have given more time for diplomacy and conciliation. Lesson of Munich, aggression must be deterred. And Morgenthau says that that is the most critical decision facing a decision maker. The lessons are both good. The question is what historical context. I'd like to ask Dori and perhaps Professor Oven, how can you tell, meaning that adopting the Munich analogy was perfectly wise, but there wasn't the monolithic, communist conspiracy coming out of Moscow, and today Vietnam is open to American influence, which could have been done without the war. And conciliation, to avoid the First World War was perfectly legitimate, but the wrong actor. How do you know?
The wrong actor, exactly. This is what I was saying. No, right? It's about the wrong actor.
So I hope you forgive me for giving a note rather than a question. But with a fair amount of generalization, I would say that Munich is still a trauma for the Czech citizens, this disappointing poll notwithstanding, but I've seen it play a major role in government decisions. Probably this is also because this feeling of a small country, 38, was later reinforced with the Soviet invasion of 1968, when we had basically the same feeling. And so the general consensus in our country is that this kind of surrender broke the moral backbone of the nation. And this is probably the most profound effect. Generates a general understanding of the fate or situation of other small nations threatened by dictators. And obviously Israel is the first place. So this is the reason which might explain generally very positive attitudes of the Czech governments, provided they are they are democratic, to see that from the perspective of the powers, the analogy of Munich seems to be losing traction. And I believe it's natural in a way, because the powers have to weigh their interests from a different perspective. But I would submit that small nations who have the experience with the existence of aggressive evil should still take the lessons of Munich seriously.
Okay.
Thank you.
I consider your contribute a privileged one. Thank you very much indeed. Next question.
Pinchas Hinbari of JCPA. I would like to ask whether we are talking here more than appeasement, but maybe a intended policy of Chamberlain and Halifax maybe for the future to make an axis with Germany and to be part of a future Europe against the other school of thought that Britain must be part the Atlantic Alliance with the United States.
Who do you want to ask to?
Anybody.
Everybody?
Everybody is ready to answer.
Okay, but I will give you 5 minutes each. I cannot give you. Be ready for that. Okay.
My question goes to Melanie, because in your fascinating talk, you criticized the media, and I saw a lot of parallels to the situation in the German public right now. However, I was wondering whether you weren't giving too much credit to the media, given the poor track record the West had in the last 2.5 decades, I would say, in fighting successful wars that actually turned out to be for the right course. I mean, I would argue that you have to go back to the first, call it U.S. or Allied Iraq War in 1991 to have a clear-cut example for a war that was won by the West and had a just course. While over the course of the last decade, we witnessed the Balkan wars that had at best a mixed outcome. We saw a disastrous war in Iraq based on lies from democratic governments toward their own people, yielding in a highly unstable situation right now. And then, of course, we've been witnessing the ongoing war in Afghanistan without the result that was promised to the public. So for people like us, and I think we're on the same page here, who don't want to take war out of the political toolbox at all, without being warmongers, of course, don't we have to put at least part of the blame on the politicians and try to come up with a more precise analysis and definition when war is actually needed, and what are the success factors that can prevent us from the disasters of the last decades?
There is Dan over there, and that's it. The last is Dan Diker. Last. Dan wants it.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Madam Chairman. My name is Dan Diker. I'm with the JCPA. My question to Professor Abideri and to Professor Kramer and to Melanie and to you, Fiamma, is that do we need to ask ourselves what the meaning of the word war is in 2018, as opposed to what we understood the word war was back in 1938, in the context of a totally different and asymmetrical reality on the battlefield? 1. 2, is the context of our discussion today, how does the context of our discussion today affect the notion of victory or failure in light of a totally new military-terror battlefield that we're dealing with today, as opposed to what we were dealing with in 1938?
Okay, that's it now. Enough with the questions, and I think I would follow the opposite order at this time. So you start, Dr. Fishman.
Which question should I?
Whatever you like. Of course, you choose it. You choose what you want to answer to, but you have to know, each of you, that you have 5 minutes.
I'll pass this time.
Okay. We can go back to you whenever you ask, okay? Melanie.
Sorry. I had two questions posed to me specifically. One, the first, have I blamed as I understand it, have I blamed the media too much for the disasters of wars like the Balkans, like the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, which should be laid at the door of politicians? Certainly, politicians made terrible mistakes in these and other wars, and they bear the ultimate responsibility for what they led their nations to, what their nations did, and how they led their nations to war. But the madness against all war in Britain, I can really only speak about Britain because that's what I know. The madness against ever going to war ever again under any circumstances against anyone in the developing world has very largely been confected by the response to the disaster of the Iraq War, the second Iraq War. Blair lied, people died. That is the mantra when Mr. Blair speaks in London, which he does very, very rarely, at risk of his life, and I say that advisedly. These demonstrators are out there shrieking, Blair lied, people died. It's not true. That is a lie. He did not lie. He may have mistakenly referred to stuff which wasn't true. He may have been told stuff which wasn't true. I don't know. I think the situation is very complicated, and I can talk about that in some detail, because I think many of the things that are said to have happened or not happened are not true. They are simply lies. The idea that, because no weapons of mass destruction were ever found, therefore there were never any, is absurd. And yet that is an unarguable truth. And that's why Blair lied, people died. And that's why we must never go to war again, ever under any circumstances, against anyone in the Muslim or Arab world. This is a lie. The Balkan War, I remember when the Balkan War was on, when the Balkan Wars were on, I remember I was working at the Observer at the time, and I remember that the media basically disinvented the idea of objective journalism. I remember it very clearly at the time. I remember a BBC correspondent called Martin Bell. He was distinguished by wearing a white suit. He went on TV night after night with exceptionally partisan reports. The Muslims were entirely the victims. The Serbs were entirely the aggressors. There were never any Serb aggressors. There were never any Muslim aggressors. There were never any Serb victims. It's basically the story told by virtually the entire media. And Martin Bell went on TV night after night with this kind of attitude. And he explained the attitude. He said, this is the journalism of attachment. I am emotionally invested in the fate of the victims in the Balkans, and I will gear my reports to that emotion. And that was considered to be absolutely right. At the Observer, I remember a great deal of concern. There were reports going into The Guardian and the Observer which were not true. They described stuff which the journalist had not seen. She or he had not been there. And there was some discussion. How could we be writing stuff, publishing stuff that isn't true? And the answer was, it was the broader truth. What was the broader truth? The broader truth was that the Muslims were victims and the Serbs were the aggressors. And so you could basically make it up. You could make it up. You could say, I observed these wretched refugees in their cart and the women in their headscarves, they were weeping. It didn't happen. I wasn't there. It was the broader truth. The broader truth is that they are victims. So that's what's been going on. Journalism has abolished the idea of objective truth, and it's also subscribes to the idea that war is literally unthinkable, and everything must be justified that can stop war. The Falklands was that was at an earlier stage, before journalism had basically abolished the idea of truth completely. That was simply fought out on partisan lines, which were rather clearer. The second question: has war done a different?
It was British, so you know.
Has war got a different meaning now than previously because it's asymmetrical? And how can we understand victory or defeat in these changed circumstances? I agree very much with the premise of the question. I don't think war has a different meaning. It takes a different shape because it's asymmetrical, and it's basically torn up our laws of war. It's torn up the way we regard it. It's torn up the fact that we have conventions which only deal with war between states, and we are left sort of literally at sea. But the point about the understanding victory or defeat is also a very troubling question in relation to this asymmetric war which never kind of ends. But the point from which I'm starting is that if you undertake military action which results in the death of innocent civilians who are coming from the developing world, whatever the circumstances, asymmetric or not, that is not permitted anymore under Western orthodoxy. You cannot do that. You cannot say, we have to defend ourselves against the incursion in Gaza by genocidal lunatics who describe themselves as their aims as wanting to murder every Israeli they can find and take over the country. You cannot say that Israel should defend itself if that will involve the killing of any civilian at all. That's as simple as that. Nothing is worth the life of that innocent Gazan. Nothing. Israel is being killed. The Israelis cannot claim they are the victims because, look, none of them has been killed. Why are none of them killed? Because the Israelis put their people in shelters, and in Gaza they put them on the rooftop so that they will be killed. That simple as that.
Okay. Martin.
I'll be very brief. Apropos the media, I said leaders are more reluctant to use the analogy now, but journalists still do. The last time I saw journalists using this was to say that the meeting between Trump and Kim was Munich, and the meeting between Trump and Putin in Helsinki was with people. I have to say, of course, I imagine that Trump probably first heard of Munich when these analogies were made and didn't had no idea earlier. Look, the basic question that we face is this: does appeasement always fail, or did appeasement fail because Hitler was unappeasable? Now, paradoxically, one must say that from a Jewish perspective, he has to have been, because we regard the Holocaust as an outlier in history. We regard it as a unique event in history. It is not a metaphor for suffering, right, and evil. But if the Holocaust is indeed, then Munich in that respect would be regarded as somehow unique. Now, what we do learn from Munich, and here I owe this insight in part to my friend Doug Feith, is that Munich tells us that there are outliers in history. They sometimes arise. What it doesn't tell us is with what frequency and what the precursors, how this will appear as in the course of its unfolding. And so that in that respect, then, the question is really unanswerable. There is no clear lesson. We must fall back on analysis. I say fall back. Analogy is the poor man's substitute for analysis. And what we need to do is, I say, surrender analogical thinking in favor of analytical thinking, and to gain a deeper understanding of each and every, the specificities of each and every context, knowing, as we know, that there has been, and there could be instances in which outliers arise in history.
I'm not sure I can answer all the questions which was raised, but one lesson I think I can draw, that when we discuss political issues, conflicts, dangers, we should address them in their context and not use emotionally strong arguments from the past, because they can be misleading. As I think Martin suggested, a lot of damage has been done to the image of Munich and appeasement by Anthony Edens claiming in 1956 that NASA is an analogy to Hitler, etc., etc. I mean, NASA was a real danger, but the analogy just didn't work out, so one should be very careful addressing real dangers in the present can be done on the basis also of the changes in what war means, unconventional war, asymmetrical aggression, etc. We have a lot of issues today which are very different from those of 1938. Let me just very briefly mention an elephant in the room, or two elephants in the room. It was mentioned by Melanie that there was some support for Nazism in the British press, but there was something much more subtle. I think it is fair to say that if you would have asked people like Chamberlain or Daladier in the 1930s, what is a major danger to Western civilization, they would not mention Hitler, they would mention communism. And therefore, this meant an inexplicit willingness to give people who are fighting communism, like Mussolini and Hitler, the benefit of the doubt and be their inexplicit allies. And this was a major misreading of history. There is an analogy. There are people today who think that the most danger, the greatest danger to Western civilization is Islamic aggression. And this brings some of them, with possibly good intention, to some very nasty alliances with people who just happen to be anti-Islamic, and therefore they are our allies. Not every anti-Islamicist is an ally of Western democracy and Western civilization, and let's not make the same kind of mistake that Chamberlain and company and Daladier made in the 1930s.
Allora, concluding and say to everybody, thank you very, very, very much for this extremely interesting session. Just a second, I also want to say something. Yeah, in my view, from whatever I have read also about this particular issue, one thing is very important from what Fisher said, which is read the texts. This is a lesson that Bernard Lewis taught us. Read Khomeini before you judge the Iranian Revolution. Read Mein Kampf before you judge what Hitler is intention to do. This is something which I completely agree with. About the issue of war that has been at large considered here. In my view, this is a good question, the question of Dan. Today, war is a completely different issue. The battlefield is full of terrorism, and the terrorism is the main issue, and then diplomatic struggle, diplomatic battle, which involves the press and the media, all the media, the social media, the BDS, and whatever. It's a completely different kind of war. So when we think about appeasement today, we must also go completely into another direction, which is not easy, and this for one more time. Actually, in my view, and according to many historians like Trevor Roper or even Neil Gruber that I have read about the issue, when Chamberlain met Hitler, war was not completely out of the table because, according to what they say, they discussed very much the issue of letting to Britain the possibility of continuing fighting his battle for its empire. So war was still there, was still considered as an issue, and was not the main issue that Chamberlain brought there. Yes, the British public opinion was asking for peace, but in the mind of Chamberlain, this kind of appeasement was still bringing with itself the promise to the British public to continue having the British Empire as something that if you have to fight for, you will fight for. So the issue of war is still very complicated at that time. It becomes completely clear after the Second World War, when, as Martin says, it implies the Holocaust. When it implies the Holocaust, then this becomes completely forbidden, and for good reasons. So whenever we discuss the issue, we must understand that whenever you try to say that war is a difficult question to discuss, well, it's really quite a point. You must not forget it. Okay, so I'm not part of the panel, so this is only some observation about what my very, very good companions sitting at this table said. And I thank them so much. It was really so important to hear you today. And thank you to all of you. And we invite you all to the next section that will take place after a nice lunch where we invite you to. Please. Thank you very much. You're very welcome. I think that, again, it's from the second floor.